Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again to the airwaves of Salam Media, our listeners, our viewers on the various platforms of Salam Media, wonderful that you're able to join us on this Wednesday evening talk to Inayat. And once again, a panel discussion as we tackle a whole host of issues. And what is still currently fresh in the minds of millions and billions right across the entire world has been the French Olympics, the Paris 2024 Olympics. Now, these games are obviously one of the biggest on the world stage, obviously creating a lot of attention. But at the end of the day, we are asking many, many questions. Now, the key issue here is why do we think that the Paris 2024 Olympics were nothing more than a facade? And looking at France, looking at the French colonial past, looking at Africa, and also looking at what is taking place in the Sahel region at this point in time, countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, moving away from the French, in fact, actually kicking them out. And also at the same time, looking at the geopolitics, looking at global politics right across the entire world, and the French involvement, not only as a colonizer, but also somewhat hypocritical. We've seen the exclusion of Russia once again from the Olympic Games. We've seen, despite calls, we've seen the inclusion of apartheid Israel against the genocide that is unfolding in Gaza. Looking at French society as well, looking at the poverty, a country that is riddled with poverty, yet this was a spectacle that France has taken great pride in, boasting to the entire world. And there are just so many other issues. We can talk about Islamophobia, the banning of French athletes, particularly those who wanted to participate donning the hijab, and banning all French participants from donning the hijab. Yet we've seen the hijab being worn, and we've seen it right at the end, where the final medal was handed out to the winner out of the Netherlands, and this medal was given to her while she was in hijab. So we see all the hypocrisy, all of this that this Paris 2024 Olympics was actually made of, and this is the reason why we question the fact on whether this was nothing more than a facade. Now, we have assembled a very, very interesting panel, diverse right across politics. We've got thought leaders. We've got Nazir Paulsen, EFF member, former member of parliament, Hassen Lorgat, social cohesion activist, Ashraf Patel, Institute for Global Dialogue researcher, and also David van Wyk, Benchmarks Foundation researcher. And as our panelists appear on the screen, I see Nazir right up there. Alaikum and welcome.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh to you and to the viewers, to the fellow panelists, Brother Hassan, Comrade David, Brother Ashraf. Good evening and salam alaikum to all of you. I must say, I feel very honored to be on the same panel with David van Wyk, as well as my other fellow. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of robust discussion. Hassan, to you as well. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, and thank you for having me.
No problem. David, wonderful having you with us as well. And I must say, I like your hat.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you. I appreciate that you like my hat. When the hairline recedes, you try to cover it up with some.
Well, I'm not wearing one, and you can see it quite clearly. Ashraf, assalamu alaikum to you as well.
Walaikum salam, Inayat, fellow panelists. Hope you're all well. Shukran.
Well, Ashraf, I'd like to actually begin with you because I know you sent me a message and you requested that I cover the French Olympics and looking at it from various angles. So I think just as an introduction and to set the scene, let us just talk about some of the key issues, some of your observations now that these Olympic Games are over.
Yes, thank you, Inayat, colleagues. Look, the Olympics is a centerpiece of globalization. In fact, the International Olympic Committee formally has a status at the United Nations as a kind of a body that's accepted within the UN system, and it's also incorporated within the UN Socio-Economic Council. So it's a very powerful body, and it comes at a time in the post-COVID world where we see lots of fractures in both geopolitics and geoeconomics. So many of the leading scholars are beginning to observe that this Olympics in a post-COVID world was meant to sort of unite humanity, because the Olympic movement since centuries essentially is about the unity of mankind, and that has been its founding values. But yet we see this Olympics being riven, taking place against the backdrop of a fractured world. We just start in Europe alone, where recent elections have seen many leading nations of the European community that have moved towards nationalism, right-wing nationalism in particular, in core nation states, particularly France, Italy, even the so-called social democratic states such as Sweden, Norway, Finland, that have always had a position of neutrality, are now firmly nationalistic, and all of them are now members of NATO. And that is quite a concern, where in a world of militarism and increased military spending, we're seeing, by contrast, there's less resources for the developing South. In fact, most of the European nations today are not going to meet their development aid targets. And that shows you that their money is going into the war effort, especially supporting Israel and Ukraine. And when we see this, it's quite horrifying that even on the last day of Olympics, the state of Israel and its supporters and apologists have tried to defend all these genocidal acts. 100 students were killed in one strike at a Gaza school in Gaza City on the last day of Olympics. So that shows you how brazen. And this very same nation state is warmly welcomed by the IOC and the European Union. So it shows you the double standards. By contrast, Russia, that has been in conflict with Ukraine, has been banned. So automatically,
Yes, Ashraf, I think Ashraf is just frozen slightly. But Nazir, let's talk about, obviously, let's look at the political angle as well. And obviously, for someone that has been in the political landscape for a very, very long time, and Ashraf spoke about geopolitics, and we know that there are many other angles that we can cover. But just looking at purely from a political perspective, and in terms of how politicized these games. I mean, these are supposed to be the Olympic Games, but to a large extent, they have been politicized as well. And also considering we are on the African continent, we know France, this colonial power. I mentioned earlier on in my introduction about what is happening to France in the Sahel region, what Burkina Faso and countries like Mali as well. And the mere fact that these were games that were held in France, and again, looking at the political implications, Nazir.
Shukran so much once again, Brother Inayat. Yes, I agree with you. It's quite ironic that I don't think what has happened at the Olympic was a facade. I think the Olympics shows us exactly the type of world we live in, a world that feels indifferent about the suffering of the poorer countries, nations like not just the Palestinians, but also the African, which France has plundered. So the world there's an insensitivity about the suffering of poorer nations, and I think it was a golden opportunity for South Africa to once again to be the the conscience of this world and remind them, look, you should consider, banning Israel from participating in these Olympics. I mean, there's precedent for it. South Africa was prohibited from taking part in the Olympics in 1964 and 1968, and in 1970 they were finally expelled from the IOC. So I think South Africa should be the country to set that in motion. The expulsion of the Israeli state from the IOC, to have them no longer participate in the Olympic Games. I think we have missed a golden opportunity, but I also think it shows how the South African government, under the ANC, has moved from a centrist government to more of a right-wing government, where we are also becoming insensitive towards the suffering of poorer nations, and especially the Palestinian people. I think, the fact that South Africa has taken the Israeli state to the ICJ, they should have been the ones to have used this also as a platform to show the displeasure of Israel participating in the Olympic Games. And once again, we've seen the current Minister of Sport actually lambast his deputy minister for being opposed to Israel's participation in the Olympic Games. So I think we've missed number one. It's not really a facade. It shows the state of the world and the indifference towards suffering nations. Number two, it shows how far South Africa has lost its claim to being the moral compass of this world.
Yes, Nazir. In fact, obviously that creates a lot more discussion, but let's just bring David van Wyk into the discussion. Now, David, obviously you've listened to both what Ashraf and Nazir has been saying, and I just need your take on your assessment, because we will unpack a lot as we go further into the discussion. But just your thoughts and your take on what you have been hearing, and also just generally your views on the Olympics.
Well, I think that first and foremost, if we look at the economic base of society in the South African context, October 7 immediately saw a massive increase in the copper price. And so much so that copper mines that were closed for more than 100 years are reopening in South Africa. And copper, of course, is the main ingredient for bullets and shells. Those things are clad in copper, and there's a boom in the copper price at the moment. There's also a boom in the price of lead, of course. And then, of course, South Africa is experiencing a massive increase in the export of coal. And the company Glencore exports mainly to Israel. And Glencore is closely associated with political power interests in South Africa. In fact, in many parts of Africa, they consider themselves kingmakers, and that is concerning. And then, of course, we don't forget about diamonds and De Beers as well. When we talk about the moral compass of the world, South Africa actually needs to stop all mineral flows to Israel or to any countries that support Israel militarily. Our minerals become blood minerals in the process of going to France, in the process of going to Britain, in the process of going to the United States, and feeding the military-industrial complex. And then we look at the corruption of neoliberalism, because if we look at Biden, his son's involvement in the economics of Ukraine, we look at Pelosi and her husband's involvement in Taiwan economically, and so on. And of course, there's massive economic interest in Israel itself. And of course, the monetary aid that goes to Israel goes straight back into the financing of politics in the United States through IPAC. So what we are seeing is like a circular revolving door of resources from taxpayers in the United States going into Israel, and then coming back in the form of support for candidates in the election in the elections in the United States, and unfortunately, there's no real choice in the United States because we're talking about the Demopublican system where people think they've got a choice, but both of those parties will simply continue the genocide and the support of Israel and basically the ethnic cleansing in Palestine that is taking place at the moment. But at the same time, the West is weakening. This started with things like fees must fall, roads must fall, colonialism must fall. All these movements that came up from the ground up, the student movements in the South African context, but also globally in support of Palestine now. And then, of course, the economic shift away from the West towards the East, and the absolute angst that the West has because they are losing ground in Africa, where other countries come and they actually invest in infrastructure and so on, rather than in military bases and military occupation. And the fear in Europe, the world is contracting. The settler colonial world is contracting all the time now, and contracting very very rapidly. And I think that contraction is positive. The only problem is that the response of the West, having weapons of mass destruction, and of course the swing towards ultranationalism, can be problematic because the West can, in its death throes, try to take the world with it.
Yes. Thank you for that, David. And Hassen, just to bring you in, and obviously looking at it purely from a social justice perspective. Now, this is quite interesting because I've seen a picture of a woman during the installation of this encampment at the Bastille. And yes, she was demanding accommodation for homeless people in Paris. Now, this took place on August the 6th, which is this year. And again, looking at it from a social justice perspective, it is clear that, there are high stakes as far as hosting the Olympics is concerned. But again, the whole issue surrounding social justice, and not only France, where we see high levels of poverty, but again, just looking at it right across the entire world, looking at France, and I spoke at France as a colonizer in Africa. We know the damage that has been done to Africa, and this is the reason why people like Ibrahim Traore has had to take drastic measures as well. And just purely looking at social justice in itself against these games. I mean, I've heard that the closing ceremony, 1,600 euros, and that is what a ticket actually cost to attend the closing ceremony, Hudson.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Inad. I mean, I think we have to talk about sports and the right to recreation, the right to play for poor and working people. I mean, Bertrand Russell, in an essay written in 1912, I think, said that the idea that poor people can have leisure seems to be abhorrent, something that the rich and the powerful thought was not necessary because the poor and others should labor for the wealthy. So I think if we want to talk about sport and recreation and the rights for it, we've got to affirm that it's necessary, but we at the same time must condemn the increased corporatization of Olympic sports. It's a big business. It's run by a mafia, and in a way, it's away from the Olympic values. Now, I subscribe to the view, and as an athlete under SECOS in a non-racial sports movement, I used to play football. I used to play many sports. So I want to factor this discussion in at home, that we need to talk about how sports in our societies have declined. It's got nothing to do with the Olympics. It's got a lot to do with how we organize sports around this idea of professionalization. In our local sports clubs, there's no longer sports that we all want to be the champions, play for the Bokke at the top levels. And this right to play in our schools, the right to have swimming pools, all that seem to be denied our people. So having said that as an outset, let me state the obsession with professionalization It's what the deal was from Mandela's time. This Invictus moment when they got the Springbok kind of colors and they took part in the Olympics 2 years before we received the formal change of democracy in Barcelona, 1992. So sports is a very, very important player in changing the minds and emotions of people. When sports changed, a number of white people began, theoretically at least, to accept the idea of black rule. But I think that we fail ourselves if we simply go wide and not talk about what's wrong with our sports. Sports in our communities and our schools have declined. When as a youngster in a school, male or female, in fact, I lament the fact that we are all male panelists, but something we should talk about. When a male or female athlete does well in a school, they take that athlete out to Grays or somewhere. They don't create fountains of these jewels in our areas. They take them out to professionalize. And it seems to be this is the big problem with us here. Now, I know my brother Nazim and others have raised issues about the government. I must say, when Peace Mabe, the deputy minister, was attacked, I was pleased that the GCIS issued a press release in her support. And this is interesting because they covered the language that we used. They say in their press release at that time, as was the case with apartheid South Africa, there can be no normal sport in an abnormal society. And the genocidal state of Israel should not be allowed to participate in the Olympics, as its conduct is in direct contradiction of the Olympics values of excellence, respect, and friendship. So what happens when? So I think we need to contest at that level, but we should not put all our eggs in that basket. We should make sure that sport is available for all, the fat, the not so healthy looking, etc., because it's about us. It's not just about playing for your country, it's playing for your health. And that's where I think we failed. I also just want to make two more points. Jibril Rajoub, the chair of the Olympic Committee, was arrested before the Olympics because he said Israel should be kicked out. And he asked for the double standards to stop, right? That you shouldn't treat Russia this way, where if they break the truce, I mean, they broke this truce throughout killing people, as much as killing 100 people the other day, where the world seemed to be very mute on it. Let me just say, so we need to change these structures, but it's going to be a long struggle that requires some compromises and working together across party affiliations. You know, when we did the international cricket boycott in early January in Cape Town, in Newlands, I had to remind them in some media program that the International Cricket Council, this ICC, not the one that's supposed to be charging Netanyahu, was formed in 1909, and this is the name, the Imperial Cricket Conference. It is taking a while for African, Asian teams to populate these bodies, to change the character of them. Exactly with the ICJ was the same thing. So we will not succeed in kicking out Israel if we do not work on the continent on sport, culture, and economic issues, because that is the only time as a bloc they will listen to us. So sport is important, but it doesn't have to be business sport. It doesn't have to be corporate sport. We all need to take a walk. It's good for our health. And this is something that the ministry has failed. I mean, for the minister to claim victories on something that he has not even contributed, claiming that he'd made Skuman and them, that's nothing to do with him, with Tatiana Smith. He's done nothing there. His work must be on the ground. If he loves so-called colored people or working class people in colored areas, he should show it by delivering quality sports in those areas, for starters, and not stopping there.
Yes, in fact, Hassan, I'm going to ask Nazim to comment on the Minister of Sport in a second. But just for information, and Hassan, I know noticeable that we don't have any female participation on this panel. We have extended 2 invitations to females. Unfortunately, one is traveling tonight to the UK, and the other one has got a funeral in the family. So in the interest of gender equality, we have reached out to some of our sisters. So that we needed to make clear. Ashraf, just coming back to you. Now, you touch on a very important issue, And you and I have been discussing this for a long time in terms of the global south and the global north. And looking at the Olympics, how apparent, how blatant was this divide between the global south and the global north? If you could unmute, please, Ashraf.
Thanks for the comments. All good feedback. If we were to unpack the Olympics 24, it has been sort of seen as very spectacular, and colleagues have articulated the billions that have been spent on infrastructure. The north-south divide has always been prominent for decades since the Cold War era. So the Olympics has always been the site of the different ideologies in global international relations with the West. And that time you had the old socialist, and you always saw that in that world you had the first world, supposedly Western capitalism, the second world being the socialist bloc, and then you had what was called the third world, the non-aligned movement. And all of them have been caught up at that point in the geopolitics of the day. But what was interesting is, despite GDP or economic growth, nations from the socialist bloc or nations that had strong social system. Hassen talked about the need to invest in sport infrastructure, in facilities, in coaches. The kind of socialist bloc, has always per capita exceeded that of the capitalist world. Despite, of course, the US is one of the largest countries in the world, you've always seen the socialist bloc, Russia, East Germany, etc., has always matched or come quite close to the US over the decades. And what we see now, quite significantly, I think the real backdrop to Paris Olympics 24 has been the rise and super success of China. I mean, this Olympics, China actually matched the US. They only ended up second due to less kind of silver and bronze medals. And another colleague was saying, if you added Hong Kong, which belongs to China, China would be number one on the table. Now, that is a super significant achievement by the East, by the global South, a nation that only 15 years ago had half the medal count as the US, today has matched and exceeded the US and Europe in every domain of sport. And what does that tell us? It tells us that you need a proper investment in infrastructure, in the social development, and contrast that to athletes from the USA. Most of the athletes, if they did not have sponsorships, could not actually participate effectively. In fact, what was interesting, amongst the American athletes, a large chunk of the African American athletes could not even pay their tickets. They had to get sponsorships. And this is a country where a Nike athlete would make $10 million a year just to advertise for Nike. So this shows you the free market capitalist system of the US has not delivered. You compare China, all Chinese athletes are full-time, all Chinese coaches are full-time, and the Chinese economic system has invested in all of the athletes. In every facility is available, from the best swimming pools to the tracks, to the equipment, to the nutrition. So that shows you the two different systems at play. And I think that is the big story, the rise of a new superpower. I think Paris 2024 talks to that. And it also shows the bankruptcy of the entire European Union, especially France. As you've mentioned, I think the hijab, Firi Hassan winning the gold women's medalist, running for a country, shows you the unequal relations. I mean, the Netherlands is run by an apartheid-style government. I mean, the party in power in the Netherlands is at the same level as the old National Party in South Africa. And it shows you the kind of move towards the right. And I think this is where the big geopolitics is coming. And also to build on community sports. Several years ago, through the BRICS nations research, we were in Brazil. And what I observed in Brazil, for instance, as we went for dinner and we were coming home from a very good dinner back to the hotel, and as you're driving through, this is now 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, a weekday night, and in the sub-district of Rio, you have every outdoor soccer facility is live, is happening. There are people playing football, netball, volleyball, beach soccer. And I think that talks to the point of the city council, the city of Rio. You speak to colleagues in Brazil, say they invest in sport infrastructure. They invest in facilities that are designed around people, that are accessible. All of those athletes have free access to bus services back home or to the train, metro train. So they just need the kits and they pitch, and everything is provided by the city council. The coaches are there. And that is why they have the best soccer teams in the world today, because sports is an ecosystem and the investment has to come at state level, but also at municipal level. And I think given the difficulties we had with metro governance in South Africa, it's a time to really focus on the role that metros and city councils, the sport budgets, are they included in integrated development plans, for instance? And we should put pressure on. I think post-Olympics is the right time to say, let's invest, let there be a sport budget in every local council. And it's possible.
Yes, Ashraf. Nazir, coming back to you and the comment that Hassen made with regard to the Minister of Sport. Now, we know that he's barely been a few weeks in office, and you've been much longer in government as well. And just, looking at, obviously the one incident was with regard to his the Deputy Minister of Sport. But since then, we've seen a lot being said by the Minister of Sport, and I think until recently as well. I think it was Joanne van Dijk, if I'm not mistaken, who had to basically support herself, her parents as well. And, he's now coming to the fore and says, they need to be reimbursed, the parents need to be reimbursed as well. But again, being a newbie, in politics, part of this government or so-called government of national unity as well, and obviously calling the shots at this point in time. And I just want to look at it from a government's perspective in terms of government, its focus on sport, but also using sport for social cohesion. And Hassen also at the end of the day alluded to this in terms of, sports, and not only from a health perspective, but also in terms of just serving a greater purpose for society. And we found that seems to be lacking, and possibly could be one of the reasons why, we don't see the type of participation that we would expect to see on a world class level, from some of our athletes as well.
Yes, shukran, Brother Inayat. I just want to touch briefly on the minister. I think the Gayton McKenzie as Minister of Sport is one of the travesties of the GNU. Number one, the only sport he's ever done was probably running from a crime scene. But, and sport is something I'm very passionate about. It's not something that I just decided to do later in life, but it's something I've been involved in from a very early age. And like you say, it's, we're missing out on the wonderful benefits of sport, as Brother Hassen has said. It promotes physical fitness, overall well-being. Regular participation combats the sedentary lifestyles that our young kids are leading nowadays, obesity and related health issues. I think, we all know about the positive effects sports has on our mental health, So I think if we had a minister that actually knew anything about sport, he'd understand the crucial role sport plays in terms of nation building. But I think we are going to have to suffer with this for a while now, where the minister would do foolish things like want to go and reimburse privileged people for what they spend, and overlook what poor black to just make it into international sport. We don't have the facilities in our communities, and that is where we should be focusing our attention, the grassroots and community-based sporting organizations and clubs, so that everyone has access to facilities, sports fields, recreational facilities, indoor sports centers in winter when we experience inclement weather where it doesn't stop us from being active. So I think the foundation is very important, and it's good that we have these conversations now post-Olympics, because now we can start laying that foundation which has been eroded over the years, because we used to have very active school sports system, and in a way, it served as a filter for those who wanted to progress to the more semi-professional and professional level of the sport, and those who so over and above the fact that in 2000 there was a white paper which was commissioned by the Minister of Sport at the time, Lukondi Balfour, that spoke about how South African sport would have been developed. But obviously the ANC has abandoned that particular white paper and all the good things that could have actually delivered for South Africa as a whole. And very importantly, and I think Brother Hassen touched on this, is the social cohesion that sport could build within communities. It could break down a lot of the barriers that we experience. But what happens is that certain communities are deprived of facilities. And if someone shows promise, so a school cannot access a privileged school's sporting facilities, but they will say, give us your bright stars and we'll enroll them in our school and they'll have access to decent facilities. That doesn't solve the problem. We need everyone to have access to proper sporting facilities. We need everyone, and we also need to be mindful of the fact that it's not just access to sporting facilities. It goes about nutrition. It goes, and also the decent coaching. If we look at poorer schools, the person who's head of soccer or rugby or athletics is the person who has some interest in the sport, whereas the more affluent schools, they'll go and get professionals. I mean, Bobby Solomons was recruited by Stellenbosch University to coach soccer, for example, be the director of soccer, a professional, someone with years of experience in the field of soccer, not just someone in terms of coaching, in terms of the administration, and in terms of playing the game. So this is the type of people we should have coaching our young kids, to prepare them for sport, even at an amateur level. Let them excel at that level. And you could lay a good foundation for we've got 4 years. Our stars are currently in high school, but we just don't have the infrastructure and the systems to ensure that we'll get the best going to LA in 2028. And we just don't have the kind of government that could actually drive such a program effectively, I'm afraid. We have a government that's more obsessed about individual stars, not about the broader aspects of sport.
David, I'd like to just touch on racism in general and racism in sport. Now, we know of the Olympic oath, and this oath is proudly, obviously, promoted during the opening of the Olympics, and talking about non-racism in sport. And yet, while the Olympics was taking place, we've seen a massive displacement process that had taken place just prior to the Olympics in Paris alone, where hundreds and hundreds of people were actually bussed out of Paris into temporary shelters. And this was in the very city that the Olympics was held. And these were the poorest of the poor. The second issue is we're finding that despite all the calls about non-racism in sport, we find that the world is becoming more racist, and particularly looking at Western Europe. When you look at many of these countries that were represented at the Olympics, whether we're talking about Netherlands, you're talking about the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and while these Olympics were taking place, right next door to France, we've seen racist, fascist, supremacist riots like we haven't seen in the United Kingdom before. And yet you have, and this is the reason why I called it a facade that displays somewhat unity. 200 countries proudly displaying their flags at the Olympics. All of that taken into account and tells us we still have got a major problem. And events like the Olympics are not able to bridge that gap or bring people together or to even move away from racism.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are important in what you are saying. The first thing is that we see even at the Olympics itself, British athletes coming third in an event, refusing to shake their hands or congratulate the Chinese athletes who came first, instead reaching over to other Europeans and congratulating them for being second. There are a couple of incidents like that, right inside the event itself. Then there, of course, was the squealing by the United States about the Chinese swimmers and, there being unfair practice because the Chinese beat them in the 4x100 swimming relay for the first time in I don't know how many decades. First time ever, I think. Now, the other thing about racism in sport that is very important is a couple of things that brings it right back home. The one thing is that the schools with the best sporting facilities in South Africa are semi-privatized or privatized. The schools with the worst sport facilities are the ones in the townships and so on, and they've never been developed since 1994. They're just as bad as they've always been, and so the disconnect between sport and education is a major problem, and that was a deliberate policy. The other thing with regard to the commodification of sport is this thing called sport betting. So the working class gets excluded from participating in sport except to take money out of their pockets in sport bets. And if we look at the sport betting in South Africa and the sport betting institutions in South Africa, and you can go and look for yourself, the people who run the sport betting facility, some of them are actually very closely tied to Israel. They tied to the system of dual citizenship that we have in South Africa, and they're part of that lobby and part of that business. That business of making money out of sport by people placing bets on different teams, different athletes, and so on. And so the working class and the poor, the black community essentially, are reduced to being couch potatoes. They sit in front of the TV, they bet their last money on who's going to win, hoping to make some money out of the process. And that commodification of sport is highly problematic because it also underpins the whole issue of the professionalization of sport. In Zimbabwe under Mugabe, I was a teacher there. We as teachers stayed at school until 5 o'clock every afternoon because we had to offer sport training and participation to the learners, whether it was tennis or rugby or soccer or whatever. Everyone participated in the school. After lunchtime, you go to the sports fields with the kids and you go and participate with them in those particular fields. The other thing, of course, is that, Mugabe expanded education very massively. In Chitungwiza Township, which is the Soweto of Harare, he built 27 high schools within 2 years. And all those schools had proper facilities, for those kids to try and get them into, a situation where they could participate in a multiplicity of things and become polymaths. We've lost the notion of our children growing up as polymaths, being able to do sport, being able to do mathematics, being able to do art, being able to do music, being able to do all these other things. And if I can just compare our schools to those schools that I taught at, the schools that he built had fashion and fabric centers, they had food and nutrition centers, they had biology labs, they had geography labs, they had libraries, they had metalwork centers, they had woodwork centers. So they had a variety of options for working class kids to actually develop themselves across disciplines and across interests, and including in sport, of course. In the South African context, we had the RDP to start off with, and then when we realized that we had to pay the apartheid loans to the IMF and the World Bank and everything else, we then massified the classroom from 23 kids to 60 kids in a classroom, and of course, no money for sport. Sport became disconnected from education. And so we see rugby performing well exactly because rugby schools are private schools, and it's private funding that goes in there. And the township schools have very little option. And even with football, club football in South Africa is very healthy, but school football is not. Soccer at school level is not. As for other sport disciplines like tennis and so on, they virtually disappeared. You don't find South Africa participating even on a global level in those particular disciplines anymore. And so we're a population of 60 million people, but we get less medals at the Olympics than much smaller nations, and we perform. We don't perform as well as much smaller nations, and that is because we have moved towards this new liberal market model with everything, including sport. So you only have access if you can pay for it, and you can only participate if you are willing to take your last few cents out and make a bet on it. And this is basically because we imitate the British and the American model of economics, politics, sport, culture, and so on. We were funded in the liberation struggle by Norway, by Sweden, by social democratic countries, and we were trained by socialist and communist countries. But yet, when we came to power in 1994, we immediately swung towards the United States in the way that we do things, including the way that we do sport. And so we fit into the colonial settler paradigm of competition and sport and so on. So that is why I think as a country, sports-wise, we are failing. But it's also the reason why China is rising. And of course, like in economics and business and so on, the West is in a decline. And for me, again, if we look at global politics and so on, that racist narrative of the world is shrinking all the time. And we've got to actually push it. We've got to actually, in our own country, push our government not to have guys like Gayton McKenzie in charge of sport. We need to push for sport to be brought back into education. We need to push for sports facilities to be brought back to school. Those school sport facilities can also become community sport facilities and not just school sport facilities. And so we see with the rise of crime, possibly due to a lack of sport and recreation in our country, apart from poverty and unemployment, our schools have become like fortresses where the community no longer have access to the school as a community asset to utilize development within the community.
Yes, thank you for that, David. Hassen, just to bring you back into this discussion, and it is clear that we have a moral dilemma here. And when I'm just listening to the discussion that's going around the panelists this evening, it tells us that there's just so much hard work that actually lies ahead, because we see the hypocrisy, we see the duplicity, we see all of that basically playing out, and it's played out in the Olympics, and it will continue playing out. And this is the reason why we need to wake up. We need to smell the coffee. We need to grasp what the true issues really are. And I'm just looking at a quick comment from Nazima Sumar that says, this is a real shame for our bright and beautiful youth, which is exactly what we are talking about. Because if this is the legacy that we see coming out of the Paris 2024 Olympics? What legacy are we leaving for future generations?
Yeah. Inayat, I'm a member of the PSA and affiliates to the BDS movement. We met over a week ago, and the Palestinian football president and the deputy were present, and they're working very hard on getting Israel expelled, I think towards the end of August. The duplicity of the powerful nations is to try and kick for touch so that they get away from the publicity and all that. And I just want to be clear, when I ask for support and investment, I don't ask for it only to be at the top. In fact, I think far too much of it has gone to the top. I say they should give it to the base, and we'll let a million flowers bloom, just improvising on Mao, and then we can see which can emerge from there. The more people play, the better it is. Now, I know we've had a very pro-Global South praise and how well they've done, and it's true. I look at Kayla Nimor of Algeria, who was the first Algerian and African gymnast to win an Olympic gold, right? And I wonder if Mr. Mackenzie was actually watching the games, because if you watch the football, even before the UEFA and others, that with my son and others, we were tracking how many people, what were their African origins, what were their roots, how were they married, to whom, in the German team. I mean, if Gaten is so narrow-minded, in fact, if all the Africans are taken out of these European teams, they'll have no teams. They may have to make 2 teams. So he has to grow up that the world is quite interconnected. Yes, there must be rational and lawful migration, but there must also be compassionate understandings. In fact, I had problems in some of the commercial stations simply compassionate conversation, looking at it. But in the height of an Olympics, you start having xenophobic attacks against someone who grew up in the country. Whatever her mom may have done, that is not the issue at this stage. Is that, are you going to vilify a young person for the crimes of their parents? You know, it's just something that the minister has not learned. And I keep reminding people on various stations, he is not the minister of sport. He's the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture. He must carry a book with him as well. He must read some poetry. He must do other things besides just try and talk about the champions that he did not make. Let me then add, so in our meeting that we had over a week ago, we are trying to get a program of action that will prioritize local, national sport, but a sport that is in solidarity with itself and poor communities, but also with those countries that are in dire need. The genocide is in Palestine, and that's our priority. So unashamedly, we want to be in solidarity with Palestine. But let me tell you closer home, 1,500 people die in this country through drowning, right? They're not water-wise, they can't swim, all those factors. But many of our schools don't even have a swimming pool, don't have it. Soweto, I remember, because I'm a student of the past, I think had 2 for about 2 million people, 2 swimming pools, one in Orlando, etc. So I'm saying to you, we must be focused. The backdrop of the Olympics there is what human potential can be if we put a lot of money, steroids, everything there. But we have to really get it down to the basics, that people need to play for fun. They need to have it as a life skill. I would go as far as to say martial arts and swimming need to be taught in all the schools. And I can include boxing. I know Nazim may like boxing there as one of the martial arts, okay? Now, look at the jewels of our countries. The young Olympian who ran the 4x4, Bayanda Walaza, the youngster is 18, and they won a silver medal, right? Okay, he's going to one of these schools where you have to pay, so I'm not going to give them praise for it. But we have a lot of these lighties in our areas, a lot of them, and nothing's happening. I want to add one of the things that we must factor in, and I'm glad you have tried, Brother Emmanuel, Inayat, about getting women participants, and I accept your bona fides on that. But the way Iman Khalif was treated, the Algerian boxer, is a travesty. In fact, one of the comrades that works with us in Palestine Solidarity, Martin from Cape Town, Jensen said, yeah, but why people don't complain that some of the basketball players are so tall? In fact, I'm a Barca supporter. I say, why Messi was so short? I mean, these things have their own benefits, right? Now, her chromosomes reflected in a certain atypical way, but so do the other athletes. Can we have a relook at all this kind of stuff? So there's a lot for us to talk. But my biggest point is that we want sports that is not for the corporations, not for the powerful, but for recreation, the right for us to have leisure time, the right for us to be able to play for fun, to hike, to do other things where we choose not to compete, but to be together in community. So there's a lot of that, but we need to realize that those who want to excel to the best of their ability must have that right. We're not going to stop that. But putting all the money for the few against the many is elitist, and as some of my comrades here have said, is part of the neoliberal way of seeing how sport is administered. We shouldn't have that.
Yes. Ashraf, let's get back to you. Now, Ashraf, I just want to focus a bit on media as well, and talking about media coverage of the Olympics. Now, we know corporate media, mainstream media, will never, ever have the type of discussion that we are having tonight, because they focus on the glitter, on the glamour, on the razzmatazz. And I've just got a comment that's come through on my phone by a sister, Shamshad Sayed, saying the opening and closing ceremonies were satanic rituals. Okay. And now this is the impression that she's given. And again, when we talk about, whether we're talking about opening ceremonies as well, you're talking about a country, you're talking about the culture, you're talking about a country, that has contributed over a period of time. And I think, to the disappointment of many, if what was displayed during the opening ceremony is indicative of French culture and what French culture is all about. Clearly, that raises many a question. But again, coming back to the media and the role of the media in promoting these events, and the focus of the media as well, like I mentioned, glitter, glamour, medal stables, basically those are priority items, but they will never, ever obviously focus on the issues that you and I and the panel are discussing tonight.
Yes, Inayat. Look, I support all the comments from the fellow panelists, because we want to create an inclusive society with social justice. And sport is essential. It's just as essential as manufacturing or services or education or health. And one of the reasons why those states with strong social infrastructure or socialist frameworks like China, like Russia, and other nations succeed is because they have elevated sport to the highest level of human development. So sport was not commodified. It was on the same level as science, as technology, as agriculture. And therefore, if you showed talent, the state system provided everything. So if you were a bright scientist and you were to go very good at mechanical engineering, they would send you to a mechanical engineering university, and you would have the whole ecosystem to support you. The same with sport. Obviously, with the neoliberal framework of the 90s and the last decades, all of those have been dismantled. And so you've seen the rise of corporate branding, and the stakes are very high. So especially in track and field, basketball, those kind of very much sports that the US media has a vested interest, is always linked to broadcast rights. And you're seeing it with multi-choice, and sadly even with SABC. Frankly, the kind of commentary, I mean, if I were to just say the SABC sports journalists there's a lot to be concerned about. I mean, they're not even well trained to start off with. They hardly understand the sport or the science behind it. It's just commentary. It's kind of armchair commentary that we're getting. Whereas if you go into other news stations or networks, they dissect the sport. They give you the insight into each sport, into each athletics, the technology behind it, the innovation. And so we've got so much underinvestment in training and development. Media, of course, CNN, Fox, BBC. If you just tune for the last 2 or 3 weeks, you would have thought the Western nations are leading. They in the top 10 in the medal count, because all the focus is purely on their interests. You hardly got any coverage of the Chinese victories, and yet China matched the US medal for medal in gold. And that in itself is a significant achievement. And David pointed out, I mean, the behavior of the British swimming team was shocking. I mean, the 2012 medalist, I think Peak, refused to shake hands with the Chinese athlete, and even made the comments that it was based on steroids or something. But then the next day, I think with pressure from the British IOC, he changed his story. He says, no, our food, there were some problems with the food and we weren't too well, and that's why we didn't do so well. So you could see the geopolitical play, because Britain is heavily dependent on Chinese trade, and they need to access the Chinese market. The British economy is in a slump, and the IOC did not want to have a spat with the Chinese, because China does take it seriously. And when China as economic superpower can retaliate, they have the economic superpower to unlike South Africa, we always playing second and third fiddle. We may just be friends with Cuba, and the US puts pressure and saying, oh, on trade agreements, we're going to punish you because you supporting Cuban doctors. And so you can see the Western-centric geopolitical play coming through. And South Africa, in some ways, are capitulating. But at the end of the day, we have very little leverage or convening power. If you're not part of powerful groupings, you get left behind. And this is what's happening. You could see it in the media narratives, how it's playing itself out in trade and investment, and where the countries take positions on Palestine, and how different kinds of pressures are brought to bear. But yet our position as South Africa, rooted in the history of liberation movements, has always been on the side of justice. And if you waver on the side of justice, you'll be exposed. And this is what we're seeing in the world today. Those that are on the side of justice are suffering immensely. Nations like Algeria, like Iran, that have taken principal positions, are suffering sanctions in the wars that we're facing. So it's a very challenging world order, and you got to be very brave to take principal positions, but you must. And I think this is the narrative of the election. I think the African athletes have done really well, especially the runners in the marathons, the 5,000, the 10,000. I think that's the really positive story for Africa. The Kenyans, the Ugandans, the Ethiopians dominating in the long distance, the Southern Africans doing very well in track and field, Tebogo Letsile winning the 200 meter, etc. Those are massive, massive boosters for Southern Africa. And it shows that if you invest, like Botswana has invested in sport, that those are the results, because the Botswana government has invested significantly in sports, especially at the coaching level. And you can see that in the outcome of the athletes. So it's not rocket science. It's input and output. And you need an ecosystem that must be part of the broader ecosystem. As colleagues have mentioned, community sport being quite central. The investments at the local level, at the municipal level, is going to be quite critical.
Yes, Nazir, staying just with Africa, and just to focus a lot more on the African continent and sport on the African continent. Now, Ashraf has alluded to the achievements of a number of these athletes on the African continent. And, more often you would find, looking at mainstream media, the likes of CNNs and the like, and when they showcase Africa, they showcase this child with hundreds of flies buzzing around this child, this malnourished child, and this is a fact. This is exactly what what mainstream media thinks about Africa, and this is the message that they send out to the rest of the world. Yet, when we look at it, not only athletes from Africa, but athletes that are residing in Europe. I mean, Japan had an athlete from Africa that was representing Japan. You see it in Belgium, you see it in Holland, and these are all athletes. And even Hassan, who won that medal, I mean, she comes from a village, being grown, obviously the upbringing of her grandmother, and she went to Holland. So all of that tells us that Africa has got
Ethiopia.
massive amounts of potential, both looking at it from an athletic, from a sports perspective, but also at the same time in terms of the economic potential of Africa. And this is where I want to come in, where the Sahel region, people like Ibrahim Traore, Mali, Burkina Faso, have recognized the African potential and have had the guts to do something, to tell the French, listen, you go out. We know what is good for us. These are our resources. We will back our our currency with the resources that we own, and we will do what is best for our people. And I'm sure that obviously can be even extended to sports within their own countries, in terms of Africa having the capacity to invest in their own sporting people.
Yes, shukran, brother Inayat. Yes, I agree. Africa has been a feeder continent for the whole world in terms of sport, in terms of minerals, in terms of just about everything. But I also want to mention specifically, other countries in Africa are a lot more focused than South Africa when it comes to sport. If you look at Kenya, for example, 72 competitors participating in 6 sports, coming home with 11 medals in total. South Africa, 149 athletes participating in 20 sporting events and only 6 medals. So it goes to show that we are not serious about it. And what I want to get back to the 2000 white paper under Minister Nkondi Balfour, where they said we must build the sporting infrastructure and we must use science to determine whether or not it's viable for us to participate in a particular, or an athlete to participate in a particular event. And he also spoke about building a continental sporting competition. And this is where the African Games comes in, continental sporting competition where African countries participate against each other. And it also brings us closer to, why are we so beholden unto Western powers as African nations? It is because we have not looked inwardly. Now we can actually be a continent of 1.3 billion people trading amongst each other. We've got just about everything we need. And if Africa were to prioritize other African nations as trading partners, we wouldn't need outside nations. We wouldn't need to go and import chickens from the USA and export the best quality grain and fruit and veg in return for chicken. So we've got to start looking at Africa as in terms of a common market for trade. We have got to look at Africa in terms of sporting relations as our closest allies, as opposed to looking towards the West. And I think, and like you say, Ibrahim Traore has realized it now. We realized it in 2013 when we established the EFF, and we said that Pan-Africanism is the future for South Africa, and building strong trade, diplomatic relations with our African neighbors is critical for the survival of Africa. We would no longer have to be beholden unto Western powers and to European powers. Already they've expelled France from Mali and Burkina Faso, and more will come. where the French is going to be impoverished. You know, we would, in the future, I see a world where Europeans come and ply their trade in African nations, as opposed to Africans going to European countries to ply the trade, because this would be, Africa is the future powerhouse of the world, but it's going to take political will. And if our South Africans are serious about our future survival in this world, we'd start looking more favorably towards our African neighbors and dispense of the xenophobia and narrow nationalism of some foolish politicians or foolish people masquerading as politicians, because a politician looks into the future as to what is best for the country, as opposed to what is best for him at that moment.
Thank you for that, Nazir. David, bringing you back into the discussion. Now, clearly, from what I'm listening from the panelists is there's a lot of food for thought, but also a lot of introspection that needs to be done. And that introspection needs to be done at various levels, on a political level, on a social level, on a socio-economic level as well. And these are lessons that we can actually take away from these Olympic Games as well, because we've unpacked just so much, we've discussed so much, just looking at some of the key considerations in introspecting. What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing?
Well, I think that again, I go back to the economic base of society, and I think that it is unhealthy that less than 5% of the population still own 72% of the land, that most of the means of production is concentrated in the hands of a small group of people, and most of the means of sport and sport reproduction is inaccessible to the majority of the people in this country. We need to open up facilities and things like that. And it really bothers me that over the last 30 years, I've seen sport facilities going to ground in townships, in suburbs, and everywhere, because sport has not gotten the kind of support that it should be getting, and the kind of social sport, the sport that communities do together, playing in clubs that belong to communities, not clubs that belong to billionaires and so on. That has all but disappeared. The reason for this is that by 1984-85, the National Party government realized they could no longer hang on to power. And so they decided, okay, we will give up political power, but we will privatize the economy, and we will privatize sport, and we will privatize recreation. Theater, drama, culture, art, all that has been privatized and made exclusive to a minority. So in a sense, we fought against apartheid, and then this is where the EFF comes in, and their analysis is correct. We fought against apartheid for political liberation, but in the process of attaining that political liberation, we negotiated away the access that we have to the best facilities, to the best schools, to the best cultural facilities, recreational facilities, and so on. And so now we sit with Parliament and the vote, and the reason why so many people don't vote anymore is because people have lost their faith in the system. They said voting doesn't change anything. It has not improved anything. And it takes me back to the World Cup in 2010. There are two incidents that I remember from that World Cup. One was I was in an informal settlement in Rustenburg, and I asked someone there, "Are you excited about 2010 World Cup?" And he said, "No, I don't have access to a TV. I don't have the means to get there. It's unaffordable for me." And then on the day that South Africa played against France, I was in Melville in 7th Street, where all the good yuppies like myself go to watch these things and drink a beer and things like that. I watched 4 domestic workers walking through the street, through the throngs of revelers. And it was such a contrast, because for them it meant nothing. They were not part of it. They were excluded from it. And privatization is a process of exclusion. It's a process of driving people away and also isolating people, because when people get together, they organize. When people get together, they talk politics. When people get together, they express their frustrations and so on, and they talk about what can they do about it. But if you can push them back onto their couch in front of the TV and they can bet a few rands on the sports event and maybe make a little bit of money, you actually depoliticize them. And privatization is a process of depoliticization. And I can remember the high levels of political organization that was there in this country in the 1980s. By 1994, we had the most organized working class in the world, probably, and in Africa, definitely. And today, the working class is no longer, if you walk into a township and so on now, the politics of the 1980s is simply gone. The organizational levels of the 1980s is simply gone. The self-agency, the self-awareness of the 1980s is gone because through a process of privatization, we built a class wall to replace that apartheid race wall that was there. And a few people out of the townships have been absorbed into the ruling class through 27% ownership. And for me, it's an absurdity that you have a country where the majority of people are limited to 27% ownership of the land, the economy, and so on. And they don't even own that yet in any case, instead of being active participants in all levels of society, including sport and culture.
Yes, I saw a comment earlier, Nazima, writing once again about the education system needing an overhaul. But Hassen, this is a question that's come through via WhatsApp as well, and I think it's appropriate that this question be directed to you as well. Should Palestine not have boycotted the Olympics due to Israel's participation?
My heart tells me no, right? Because they had 80 athletes there, and the Zionists had 88, I think. Some of their flag carriers were people who were involved in writing love letters on the bombs that killed Gazan people. But the protests and support for Palestine was enlivened by seeing Palestinians there. It's a way of fighting. I mean, we used to say when we were negotiating trade deals, there were some of us were inside, others were outside. I don't want to begrudge those people. Over 400 athletes have been killed before the Olympics. What does it serve, for them to not be present? I mean, 100 people got killed yesterday on the 10th of August. And I was actually, my response was, besides talking to my local activist union, was to write a poem about it, calling it The Witness, because I really think that Palestinians must be present and visible everywhere so that we can talk about them. So I don't think so, but because they, when they were there, were very, very courageous. The day before the Olympics started, they called out Israel and said, as athletes, we don't believe these guys should be here. So what does it serve that they don't come and the Zionists keep playing? But let me just tell you what I think my priorities are going forward. This Olympics, I mean, as you could see that the refugee team won a medal, I think a bronze medal. It shows the human spirit that people who've suffered actually can endure and overcome this. Israel has handicapped Palestinians, shot them in the legs, killed them off. Our people in Cape Town and elsewhere recently hosted the Palestine national team. Same question should be asked, should they be traveling out there? Yes, because it makes Palestine visible. Palestinians are not just those who are resisting in that form. They resist culturally, they resist through poetry, they resist through song, and they resist in the battlefield. So for me, I think they should be visible in every way. So some of my takeaways. I mean, I think you're going to. I've been the one not to talk about the global politics because I think we need to have a separate discussion about how these military coups in Africa that took place in the Sahel, all of them, barring the one of Gabon, which I think is a French coup, which was anticipating a coup, kind of took a coup so that it could be in French favor. But Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, all of them were anti-French coups because the French never really decolonized, never really left like the Brits and others did. So that is a separate discussion. My fear for these Sahel countries is that they also have a big brother looking after them or close by. All that may be strategic, but we must be mindful not to replace one set of anti-democracies with another set of it. The sufferings of the Niger people, where they have no lights but provided electricity for France, all those issues we can talk in a separate discussion. So I agree that it's an indication, but what is a cohesive French politics, in African politics? Mali played against Israel and drew 0-0, or was it 1-1? Yeah, they should not have played, one could argue. No, the journey is going to be long. These countries have just overthrown their masters, and they have to find their feet. And it's the countries that we need to talk to about building a consistent politics that is supportive of democracy, equality, and justice. So let me my second major interest that I have is that why is it that our national sports are not shown on the public broadcaster? We paid quite a bit to have the Olympics, and I don't begrudge them for that. The public broadcaster has a great reach, but we should be watching our locals, young people, play football. I keep telling my son that I saw Lamine Yamal, who's now Barca star at 17. I saw him on Spanish TV when he was 9. We don't have that. The TV looks like it's only for the pros. That is wrong. So we must have conversations about the public broadcaster, that it must be servant to us, must give us expression. People who look like us must be seen on there. And that's the way we promote different games and sports that are marginalized in our societies.
Well, shukran for that, Hassan. I think we're almost at the end of the broadcast, so I'm going to go around very quickly through all the panelists and just to get some final thoughts. Ashraf, starting with you.
Yes, I agree with the comments made, and it builds towards linking sports to development, to local development, to community development. Sports, the Olympics actually is formally called the Olympics movement. It's not just the Olympics. And that talks to the issue that it's part of a movement for humanity. It's probably one of the best platforms to unite humanity. And unfortunately, 2024, the divisions have been so sharp. So I think the first thing is to revisit the spirit of the Olympic movement. Secondly, to invest in community level sports, to build the capacity of local clubs and associations. So if you take a fellow global South power like Brazil, and you look at their success in all areas of sports, especially football, they have a very strong tradition of clubs. So clubs are actually like families, like communities. And I think we used to have parts of that in the 80s and 90s, but all of that has collapsed. So how do we create community spirit through sports, through clubs, through associations, get people together and link that, as colleagues have mentioned, to the school system. So the school sport should not be divorced from community. And I think that could be a starting point. And some suggestions could be made for local government, for metropolitan government. How do we allocate budgets? How do we train coaching? Coaching is huge. There's different models in different countries. And in many of the countries that have been super successful, coaches, sport coaches is a highly regarded part of society and highly rewarded at different levels. So we should invest in the sports and the infrastructure. And finally, sports is social justice. I think we all agree on that. How do we continue with the movement for social justice? Just two things. South Africa, again, we all talk about the inequality, the Gini coefficient, but we have two massive problems. One is obesity. South Africa has an obesity problem, especially in the Black communities. And a lot of the research from universities, I think the UCT study, and with studies have shown obesity amongst blacks are very, very high across all classes. Now, what does explain that? We need to look at the entire media public health communication system. Why is obesity so high? Why is diabetes so high? And then on the other hand, malnutrition. So we have this dichotomy: high obesity, high malnutrition. How do you create a winning nation? And I think sports plays a central role in that, and we should actually see it as part of a broader national development and health initiative.
Well, shukran for that, Ashraf. And I also saw a comment come through talking about the comrades that wasn't broadcast on the public broadcast as well. And Nazir, coming to you, some final thoughts? If you could unmute, please, Nazir.
Okay, shukran so much. So in our schools, if you look at physics, for example, physical science is disappearing from the curriculum of poorer schools due to a lack of resources, because it's a resource-intensive subject. So in the same way, sport is also disappearing from our poorer schools because of lack of resources. And if we want to change that, we need to foster a transformation agenda, sports and economic spaces that remain predominantly white or untransformed. So we need to look at those aspects of sport and recreation where poorer communities are deprived of facilities. And and as you said, Ashraf, it's costing us in terms of the obesity factor and the levels of lifestyle diseases as a result of inactivity. And if we want to change those things, we need to look at investing more in sports facilities. I know the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure said he wants to turn South Africa into a construction site. Go and construct sports facilities in our communities. Recruit the labor from within that community. Provide work, provide jobs, employment opportunities for people in that community, and let them build their own sports facilities. They'll take greater pride in something that they've invested in, that they've put sweat and blood into. I think the solutions are simple. We just don't have a government with the right ideas. And I think, going forward, this is one thing that we'll be pushing in Parliament. Build facilities in our communities. And when you build those facilities, employ people from that community to build those facilities, to maintain them, and to take care of them. So, and that way we would get all the wonderful benefits of sport, social cohesion and community building. Sport has the power to bring people together, and we must not let this opportunity go begging. And also, hopefully the GNU collapses very soon. We'll get proper people to run something as essential as sports, arts, and culture one day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Nazir. David, over to you.
Yeah, Gramsci noted that the oppressed and the exploited should contest every terrain possible. And we should not just sit back and accept the pushing back of the public and the commons. We should defend the public and the commons, and we should expand the public and the commons. And that includes in sport. We should not accept being pushed out of sport. We should not accept that, sport is a commodity. We should actually consider sport almost as a human right. Good health depends on sport. And part of the problem also with diabetes and obesity has to do with the food monopolies in this country and the nature of agribusiness in this country, which also needs to be addressed. At the moment, agriculture and food production is all about export and all about profit, not about feeding the nation. So we actually export quite a lot of food, but we have a 40% hunger amongst children in our country. So we need to really speak out and contest. Not just the four old guys like us. We need to get a new generation of people to come through and contest every terrain.
Thank you for that, David. And Hassen, the final word from you.
Yeah, no, I think that we need to work together in a sports justice coalition. You know, I mean, I like David's point about contesting, because that's how my politics is crafted. Nazir, I want to say this to you. I think that our movements are emboldened now that there's a GNU, seeing what we've lost and what we should have. So I'm not one who simply look at the party and say we reject. I publicly, for the work I do in it, supported the NHI, all those kind of movements, because I think sometimes, as Amilcar Cabral has said, all the good people are not only in one party. So for me, we need to try and see how we build a politics that is non-sectarian, and actually we can agree on stuff, differ on other things, but agree what is essential. Kids don't have enough food. In a school that I had some association with when I was expelled from teachers training in Eldos, in fact, when I went there, there were soldiers occupying it in that times. There was some gun violence this morning in the historically colored areas. Now, I say this because this happens as well. Kids in Katlehong or elsewhere, Lens, stab each other with the scissors or whatever. We have problems, and sport can help to address that. But we cannot run away from these kind of problems. And it's not the problem of the GNU. It's the problem that we have taken our foot off the pedal, that we have not worked together. We've played kind of politics, and we have not seen what is important. In fact, you're right. Maybe this new liberal pact must fall. But I would say it mustn't fall because so soon, until we are better organized. There's also been an investment strike by capitalists. Now when they see their brothers, mainly brothers, there, they want to invest in the economy. We should organize workers into unions, and we should do something. So I don't want to see it in a big picture. I want to see it at a very local level. And it's great. I'm glad that Ashraf raised the issues of obesity and all that. We will add this into our program of action. But nothing stops us from walking in the evening in groups, making our community safer. There's agency that we can reclaim as we put pressure on it. We shouldn't have started to organize now about sports because it's Gayton, or agriculture because it's that other guy who doesn't know what genocide means, right? That we should have done it before, when our governments had some so-called legitimacy, or more or less more legitimacy. We didn't do it. We are now starting. And what we need to do is to start afresh, build these issues, build them together, make sure that in the areas that are more affluent, that we share with poorer areas. The Tennis Club Indonesia wants to have a solidarity event in October in solidarity with Palestine. There are various initiatives. People want to do golf days, but we have to tell them, hey, get the neighboring area in, enhance the sport. Let's talk about cohesion at home and solidarities with each other. So there's a lot to be done, and I'm not pessimistic. I'm really fired up to do more.
Well, shukran for that to Nazir Paulsen, Hassen Lorgat, David van Beek, Ashraf Patel as well. Shukran. We thank you for taking time out this evening with us right here on Salam Media, and all the best. And I think it's been most absorbing. I think it's been a wonderful discussion, just not focusing on unmasking the French colonial past and the issues surrounding the Olympic Games, but I think there's just a lot more. There's so much food for thought. There's so much that we need to look within ourselves as well. And there's just far too many lessons that we need to take from this discussion this evening. So to all of you, much appreciated once again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum
Alaikum salam, and peace be upon you.
salam.
Well, that brings us to the end, and I must say a most absorbing discussion, really. And We've had a wonderful host, group of panelists this evening right here on Salam Media, and I've been blown away by what I have heard actually, and the dimension and where this discussion had actually started and where it had actually ended. And again, it's all about lessons. It's about taking lessons from these events that are taking place or that have taken place as well, and just exposing so much, and just looking at the world, looking at the inequality, looking at hypocrisy, looking at duplicity of the entire world. All of this actually being shown up in more ways than one, whether we're looking at it from a political perspective, a social perspective, a socio-economic perspective, and also just so much for us in South Africa to actually think of. And with that, I'm going to be signing off once again. An absolute pleasure being in your company for myself and the team. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.